Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Crypto Hipsters Podcast, where I interview founders and co founders, entrepreneurs and artists, executives and stay at home hipsters in crypto and blockchain around the world. And I have an amazing podcast for you today. Let's get to it. Today, I have a very special guest. His name is Reggie JERATH. He is the founder and the CEO of Gather. Reggie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on. It's an absolute pleasure.
You're welcome. You're very welcome. So to kick things off, I'll ask you, what is your background, and is it a logical background to what you do now?
Sure. I think it's more transitionary, but it's I started my career in oil and gas. I was working in North Iraq, managing about 200 or so employees, and Iraq and India, based out of Dubai. But I spent a lot of time in Kurdistan, and that's how I essentially started or kickstarted my career. And then, after about doing 2 years of that, and more importantly, after ISIS invaded, left that industry because that whole event kind of left a bad taste in my mouth. I moved into advertising at that point, joined Publicis Group, but bounced around a bunch of different agencies. And after that, I founded my first startup, which was my first entrepreneurial experience, which was a tech-enabled concierge that pivoted into a logistics platform similar to Deliveroo or Uber Eats. So we built the tech and provided the riders to banks and supermarkets, etc. And around that time, I started to get into mining, crypto mining specifically, POW with a bunch of spare laptops and computers, and that's where I really got into cryptocurrency and blockchain. My first ever exposure to crypto was in college, many years ago, when Bitcoin was maybe 600 pounds or so, and I was in the UK. And being a typical college kid, I was like, okay, we can't even afford a Bitcoin. Let's just buy some Litecoin. So that was my first ever exposure, but I properly got into crypto a few years ago with POW-based mining. And that's, along those lines, I was hired as a consultant for a website, a webcomic actually. And his pain point was, how do I monetize my content, my niche content, without bombarding my users with advertising? So during my research, I discovered something called CoinHive. For those not familiar, CoinHive was one of the first JavaScript-based Monero miners. So essentially, when you visit a website that has CoinHive enabled, your spare compute power is being used to mine Monero. That idea itself, trade spare computing power for revenue, I was like, that's genius. That's amazing. But coming from an advertising background, I knew that that's not going to be accepted by major publishers. They didn't have a lot of features that publishers would have required. So it just clicked. And that moment was what lit the spark for the initial idea of Gather, right? Provide an alternative form of monetization for websites and application back three years ago. And what Gather is today is definitely very different from where it was birthed.
So that's my next question. Because as I mentioned to you before I started recording, is I initially find you on LinkedIn. I found you on ICO Bench. You and I have that in common. During the ICO days, I was also an advisor on ICO Bench. So I wanted to find out the journey of Gather since then to now. What are some of the things that you've built and that you have been up to?
Sure. I mean, Gather, it's been crazy. We started with a very simple mission, right? It was just one feature. It was not one feature, but one service. Alternative form of monetization based on mining the most profitable cryptocurrency at the time. And our token had a bunch of utility within the ecosystem itself. And over the 3 years, it evolved into a much wider ecosystem. We have governance that's active right now, that's working. We have a governance board, a foundation. We have, to put it lightly, right, we have 3 service lines right now. One is called Gather Online, which is the alternative form of monetization. Then we have Gather Cloud, which was introduced a lot later, which is essentially, we have a whole masternode system. Our blockchain is hybrid, so it's masternode, staking, and proof of work. So the masternodes actually supply compute power and storage to the network, which is then bought on or rather resold to enterprises at a cheaper form of compute and storage, which is packaged into different services such as file transfer or runtime environments or containerization as a service, which is a lot cheaper compared to AWS or GCE specifically. So Gather Cloud was another service that was being developed or is still being developed with services being added on. That came on board. And then it added another service or product, which is right now we're a layer 1, but in about 6 weeks or so, we'll be out with our own layer 2. The layer 1 right now is live with tokens transacting the blocks, blocks being produced. Yeah, so and that's on the brand of Gather Enterprise, and within this brand, you have something known as child chains, which is the latest, let's say, news we have. We're incubating about 6 or so different projects, and I think the most important thing to state about these projects is they're all revenue generating projects, or they have active users. They're not, a white paper and a pitch deck type of project. We're incubating them, helping them raise funds, develop their business strategy, and go to market specifically. And they will be deploying their blockchains on Gather specifically, or rather the tokens on the Gather layer 1, and when the layer 2 releases on the layer 2, or migrate over to the layer 2. So this is how Gather is kind of morphed in the last 3 years from a very simple alternative form of monetization to what you see as is right now. And we proved the alternative form or Gather Online. We proved it. We brought it online for publishers, and it was extremely easy to acquire users. We didn't have to do any outboard marketing or outbound marketing at all. People just came to us because, hey, it's just extra money for publishers.
Great. Awesome. So you're currently traded on exchange for level 1 or no?
Yeah, we're on a bunch of exchanges. We're on Uniswap, as a DEX. We're on Ascendex or BitMax. We're on Gate, we're on Who, and we're on BitThump.
Great. So that's an impressive growth. So let me ask you this. You mentioned you're trading spare computer power, right? Basically wasted computer power and harnessing it for the greater good. How do you harness it? Is it through this containerization process, or how are you actually capturing that and monetizing it?
Sure. So when you visit a website specifically, you have to provide consent. So everything we do in Gather is consent-based. So if you don't provide consent, we're not going to be taking your spare computing power, right? Once you provide consent, what's actually happening is that your spare computing power is being used to secure the Gather blockchain and associated child chains via merge mining. That's what's actually going on there. And in turn, the publisher or application owner earns revenue.
Great. So you mentioned merged mining, right? What do you merge the mining with? Bitcoin, Litecoin?
No, so it's the child chain and the Gather layer 1. The Gather layer 1 being the parent chain and the child chain being the aux chain or child chain.
Okay, I understand. So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you is there are some looming regulations placed on data collection. It's all over the world, right?
GDPR, everything, yeah.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about that. What are some of the regulations and the potential impact to you, your company, the industry, and the publishers?
It's geographic based, definitely. So, if we look at EU, there's a lot more stricter policies in place as per what we have to kind of work with versus, let's say, Middle East, East Asia, or South America, US being another rabbit hole on its own, right? If we talk about EU, one of the biggest problems we face with publishers is because of GDPR compliance, they have a bunch of different disclaimers that they have to put up, right? And we had to create custom process flows to ensure our consent banner or consent mechanism works within their existing workflows, right? You don't want you land on a site, you're hit with like 6 different disclaimers, and then on top you see a 7th Gather disclaimer. So you package all that together, so it's just one big disclaimer for cookies, opt-ins, or whatever it may be. That's for EU specifically. If we talk about East Asia or Southeast Asia, there's not really much of an impact, or even Middle East. US, yes, we're very, very careful. It's similar to how things are in EU, how we deal with data compliance. We do have a data compliance policy in place, which is managed by our general counsel. And yeah, it's not, as of now, we haven't seen anything major happen in terms of Gather because of the way we're kind of structured. We're not a US company. We're not an EU company at the end of the day, right? We're issued out of BVI. We have operating companies in India, Dubai, and the foundation being set up in Panama. Right, we're very careful to ensure that we maximize risk aversion here. because of how things are going on globally, right? I mean, look at Binance, what's happening with them, for example.
Right. My last interview was with somebody. We talked about Binance, what's going on, and they're changing their policies and working on that. So I assume that people are shifting, and that these platforms will need to find, new ways to do the business model or to profit from advertising. What do you think will need to change? What do you think you'll need to do to maintain building your company up and others?
I think it's just being right now. All of us within crypto, we operate in a gray area, right? There are few jurisdictions worldwide that are completely okay with cryptocurrency, and the ones that do exist, it may be good for that jurisdiction. For example, Zug in Switzerland, right? Just as an example, or certain places in the States. But then how do you deal with international clients? How do you deal with international customers? Because we're not just a decentralized DAO or something where there's no paperwork or company or something. We run this as a business. So anyone in similar positions, which is many other companies or projects, you're all in the gray area because you're working with cryptocurrency. How do you cash out to bank accounts? These are very real world problems that people in crypto don't really think about too much. And the way to deal with this is that you have to just stay on top of things. You have to be ahead of the game, always planning 2 steps ahead, and just minimizing risk as much as possible and seeing try to predict where the next regulatory hurdle is going to come from, and then mitigating it or planning to mitigate against it.
So how have you been able to navigate that gray area so far?
Multiple companies is one. How we structure our payments and our receivables, what we split in fiat and tokens. As what we basically do is we try not to really deal with the fiat world as much as possible, but even though at some point you need to do it, we try to transact as much in cryptocurrency as much as possible. It just makes things a lot easier for cross-border payments, specifically for vendors, etc., or even when you have incomings. Again, when you have incomings in fiat and you want to translate into crypto, for example, you need to have real-time settlements, which is another headache on its own. And then in terms of risk mitigation, yes, having multiple companies, so a token issuance company out of BVI, an operating company that can receive revenue in Dubai, and then a cost center that does the development based in India, and then an on-demand dev center somewhere in Europe, for example, right? And the foundation being in a place which is in the US, most importantly, and is somewhat okay with crypto, i.e. Panama for us.
Got it. So you're navigating the environment. So then let's ask about the environment. These changes, these navigations. How does it impact the mining that your company does, and that other miners face right now too?
So our company and other miners are two different things because essentially we're using spare computing power, right? And we're mining our own blockchain at this point. When we talk about other miners, such as, let's say, BTC miners, LTC miners, or people who are running farms, here's a very, very good example. This is a little bit off the record. Well, it doesn't have to be off the record, but when the China mining ban came through, right? You had that massive hash rate fluctuation that came. And these guys, they started scrambling, essentially, right? Looking to where to relocate their farms to, and they contacted every government they could. I mean, off the record, I can tell you that there was one person willing to pay $10 million finder's fee to relocate his 1,000-megawatt farm. To put that in perspective, that's enough power for 3 small-sized cities in the U.S. So adverse regulations can cause a significant impact to miners. To large-scale miners specifically, or anyone in the mining space. For someone like us, no, because the nature of how Gather works, right? Essentially, you're harnessing end users' computer power. So you could be in Yugoslavia or Denver or even London, right? But it doesn't really matter at the end of the day unless we're specifically targeted by a regulator for a specific reason. And because we operate the way we do, above board, we have compliance checks in place, policies, all of that, GAP, follow different types of system, IFRS, et cetera, we're okay so far. But again, the nature of the industry we're in, you never know, right? But so far, knock on wood, it's been good.
Great. So I want to circle back to something you said earlier, comparing your mining operation or to AWS, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a narrative out there that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are bad for the environment. And when you look at companies like AWS, how much more efficient is your mining, do you find, than a company like that?
Well, for one, we're not creating waste here, right? Because we're using resources that would have otherwise been wasted anyway. So it's just increasing efficiency at that point. Whereas on AWS, these are systems which are expanding and creating more energy waste.
Okay. So what do you feel would be some of the greener opportunities in mining, both at Bitcoin mining
Utilize it.
and what you do?
So utilization of spare compute power, like how we do it, and then if we talk about in the green space, there are multiple ways. It's all about your power source, right? Where you're getting your electricity. So it could be green sources, solar, wind, electric, etc., etc. Um, and then if you have excess power, for example, in certain areas of the world, they have excess electricity via geothermal. I believe I can't remember where it was. I think it's El Salvador. That's a good example of using spare or excess capacity, right? That's another way to look at it instead of going with the traditional, let's say, coal-fired electricity plants. And this is what large-scale miners really have to think about after a certain amount of time, is what their environmental impact is.
El Salvador is using a volcano, I think.
Yep, that yes.
So how do you capture the benefits of the environment where you're at? What's just some of the things that the founders need to look at to do that?
I mean, just off the bat, compare. Hey, if I'm going to go with source A, let's say is coal, right? I'm taking one of the dirtiest forms of fossil fuels here, versus, let's say, solar, right? Which is capex heavy, relatively. You're going to look at, okay, hey, coal might be a lot cheaper to me in the long run, or even in the short run, but what is the impact I'm creating here, right? That I forgot. They have to look at, okay, what is the impact, or how much I forgot what the measure is for coal in the environment, or pollution created in the environment. How much whatever the measure is this creating for sustaining my mining operations, versus what is the capex I'm spending on let's say solar farms. And a good example of that, out here in UAE, they have something called Masdar farms, which being a desert, you get a lot of sunlight. Using something like that to power BTC farms is very efficient at the end of the day. CapEx pays off over time as well, and you're not impacting the environment.
Got it. So in the publishing space, what do you think? That's the overall Bitcoin environmental space. But is there a way to do it for publishers to get their voice?
We're doing it. How we're doing it specifically, because we're capturing wasted resources and utilizing them. For publishers, for publishers, in all honesty, they really don't care about the environment too much. For them, it's just the extra revenue and the user experience that comes out. Because in all honesty, today, no one really likes ads. And most websites that have ads are either clickbait, or there's so many ads that, some of the websites are unreadable. You have paywalls, a bunch of different issues. So this is a very viable business model for a lot of different websites and applications.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I get a lot of pop-ups. I get a lot of ads. I get like 50 phone calls every day from all over, people I don't know trying to sell me something. How do we overall, make a dent into making that more efficient and preserving people's, I say privacy, but preserving people's, privacy. How do you navigate that environment now so they can clean that all up?
Well, start using Gather. That's honestly, we don't collect data on end users here. We don't need to, right? Because we're not hitting them with targeted ads, finding out what every single keystroke they're hitting. Is that, hey, you provided consent, great. That's all we need at the end of the day. Start using Gather. And from our trials, our alphas, our betas, extremely easy to acquire small, mid, large, extremely large publishers. So people clearly want this. That's not the problem here. It's about getting it to a point where it's ready to scale extremely fast. Because that's what the issue we had initially.
I don't think anybody likes having their data sold to people,
No,
and
not at all.
targeted specifically. So
I think yesterday I was searching on Google for scuba diving lessons, right? And I open up Instagram. The first thing I see, scuba diving lessons in Dubai. I'm like, God damn it, really?
Wow. Yeah, they find a way to take your personal preferences and target you and try to sell it to you. So I'm just, I'm glad that somebody who are working on that. It's needed.
100%. I agree. It is definitely needed. That's why Gather was born.
Awesome. So I want to thank you very much for your time today. I enjoyed our conversation, and let me ask you this: how can people find out, more information about you, about Gather, about what you guys are up to, and what your roadmap is going forward?
Sure. To find out more about Gather, you can just visit our website, www.gather.network, or join us on Telegram/Gather Network. To find out more about me, you can just visit me on LinkedIn, type in RAGHAV JERATH, or on Twitter, which is Reggie J. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an absolute pleasure.